Good afternoon, California Partnership. My name is Laurie Schipper. I'm the director of the Iowa Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I have been the director for a long time here, since 1993. And I understand that you're looking at policy initiatives that might be trends in the future that you'd like to consider. So I want to tell you about what Iowa did starting in 2012 as we transitioned to a new way of delivering services to victims. In 2012, we were facing substantial funding crisis both at the state and federal level, and our state funder, the Attorney General's office, approached us and said, we can't sustain what we're doing currently. We're giving you a very short amount of time to come up with a plan that we can sustain and can contract and grow based on funding. So we worked with our state grant administrators and the Sexual Assault Coalition, Beth Barnhill, on coming up with an outline of a plan that looked at regionalization of services, looked at creating a mobile advocacy way of delivering services versus a shelter-based service delivery system, and a housing first component. And one of the goals being that if we did that, if we changed how we allocated resources, we'd also be able to invest more heavily in our sexual assault services as well as our culturally specific services. So after coming up with this outline of a plan, which I have to be really honest, was the most difficult, painful couple weeks of my life. Lots of sleepless nights, lots of thinking about not knowing if this was going to work and dreading rolling this out to membership. This happened in June. Our membership meeting was in July. Beth and I and our grant administrator, Donna Phillips, and Janelle Malone, met with our membership for a 2-day meeting where we told them that we would be regionalizing, that we would be only funding one domestic violence comprehensive service program, one sexual assault comprehensive, and one shelter-based program in each region. In addition, our culturally specific programs would also be funded. 2 most difficult days of my life. The grief was intense. We'd had people that had been doing the work for a really long time, and we'd had survivors that had grown up in the movement doing this work. So you'd look around the room and you knew that a year from now, not everybody would be in the room, that some people would not survive this process. And it was extremely painful. For me personally, I just kept thinking about, what are we doing? We're dismantling something that we don't know if we can put it back together again. And I didn't have any idea if what we were doing was actually going to work. It hadn't been done anywhere else in the nation. We proceeded to ask each region to come together and come up with a plan to decide among themselves what their strengths were, what were the strongest programs, what they did best, and if any viable plan came out of their region, we would seriously consider funding it. Some of our regions had more programs than others, so some of them were looking at cutting programs down from 7 to 3. So some regions, it was highly conflictual. We brought in mediators. The coalition stepped in to try to help people talk through this process, and ultimately it was a competitive process. Other regions decided to take a different path. They decided every time they met, they would only talk in regional terms. It was our funding, our service delivery system. They would only talk positively. And they actually did decide among themselves which programs were the strongest and what their strengths were. So which of them should provide the SA component, the DA component, or the shelter. I will never forget traveling to a northern region and having one of the programs, who I had worked with her for 20 years, look at me and say, we've decided among the 4 of us that if you're only going to fund 3, that my program isn't the strongest. Still makes me really emotional to think about what we asked our advocates to do on that day. We asked them to put aside everything that was personal and put the survivors' needs first. And most of them did that. And I will leave this work with the utmost respect for those that did that, because in the end, we did make things better in Iowa. After that awful meeting where we grieved and planned, we went into the communities all around the state. We did town hall meetings in every region, at least 2. Those were equally painful. We had community members screaming at us that the blood of battered women will be on our hands and that women will die under this model. And I can tell you that there were nights when I laid in bed thinking they might be right. I don't know. What I did know is that what we were doing currently wasn't working, and that I would rather have my career end having tried something different than to look back 30 years from today and say we weren't brave enough to take the next step, that what we did was the same, and we left out most victims of sexual assault and domestic violence from our services. I wasn't willing to do that, and neither was Beth. So we proceeded. We funded. We were also flexible with our plan. I want to say anybody that came up with a good solution, we absolutely tried to make that work, except for the regions. We kept the regions set because we knew if we allowed that to be flexible, we'd still be talking about how to divide the regions up. So within that, people could offer viable options. So we did fund more than one sometimes if it made sense demographically or even geographically based on catchment area. So in some areas where we had a huge urban population, there may be a second domestic violence comprehensive program funded or even a second shelter. But it was still closing from 24 programs to 8 shelter programs. Lots of media pushback. People didn't understand this model. They thought it was all funding driven. It was not. We believed that almost every client that we saw, every victim, every survivor would do better if they were placed in affordable, safe, permanent housing. Even those folks with complex issues, with substance abuse, with chronic mental health issues, with chronic homelessness would do better in their own safe, affordable, permanent housing, as long as supportive services were wrapped around in addition. So we were going to test that. We worked with Washington State, who'd done parts of this. We worked with Portland, Volunteers for America, who'd done parts of this. We decided that it was our best shot, and so we implemented it. And 3 years later, the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence stayed with us and looked at our process, and in fact today presented their findings to our membership. We served 50% more sexual assault victims during this period under this model, which was a huge success and one of our biggest goals. We served far more culturally specific survivors in our programs than we had previously. We are housing a tremendous number of survivors, rapidly rehousing them. So when they call, instead of saying, why don't you come in and shelter, well, and we'll figure it out, we do an assessment and we probably can get them into some housing, level of housing immediately. For those folks who need shelter, we still have shelters available, and every program had to come up with a plan for emergency shelter in every community. Whether it's a board member's RV or guest house or motel hotels, arrangements with landlords or motels, landlord agreements. We have advocates who carry keys in their pocket and they can show at will apartments. People were very creative at housing people in emergency, but also in developing relationships within their community to get safe, affordable, permanent housing available. Where it has been difficult is that left in our shelter programs folks who had lots of issues, multiple layers of trauma, chronic mental health issues, chronic homelessness, folks that were harder to house because multiple oppression. So what we haven't accounted for is that our shelters are, for the most part, full now, and the staff there are dealing with levels requiring different skill sets than we had previously, and a concentration of trauma that has produced secondary trauma that we're still figuring out how to best handle and assist with. So that's one of the things that we weren't prepared for, that I would encourage folks that are thinking about moving to a mobile advocacy system. We were able to hire, because of the money we saved closing shelters, 133 new advocates immediately. It's freed up client assistance so that we can assist people with any number of issues that are barriers now. We can provide long-term housing supports. We can provide college class resources, steel-toed work boots for a job, anything almost that is a barrier. We can now meet survivors where they're at. We go to where they are. We hired advocates in the communities that survivors live in. They no longer are based in their program. They're out in the community, and that's where they work. They meet people in laundromats. They have fax machines and other equipment in their trunk, forms in their trunk. They telecommunicate for supervision. We have a very strong mobile advocacy system in place. And our shelter-based system is limited on purpose. There will always be a need for shelter, and we funded our 8 strongest shelter programs, but it is still difficult work, and so we're still trying to figure that out. So this is not for everybody. We had great communication between our funder and between the coalitions and membership. We tried to do this before we were in serious crisis, but I can't urge people to think about long and hard how difficult it is and the things you should have in place. It was not an easy process, and we were lucky that we had a funder that was trauma-informed and client-centered and was flexible with us, was willing to make funding flexible in terms of client assistance, and that we had the Sexual Assault Coalition and the Domestic Violence Coalition that had great respect for each other and worked hand in hand pretty much 24 hours a day, every single day for the first year. It was a lot of work transitioning. This happened from the top down, and in some ways that was awful for our programs, and there are some states that are doing a very thoughtful process from the bottom up, which I am very jealous of. I would also tell you that our programs would say, as painful as it was, having someone else impose it meant we got through it. And some of them would tell you that they're afraid that if it was sort of posed to membership because the grief was so intense, we could still be talking about it today. So there's pros and cons with that. And I can't tell you the journey that you should take, because our state is also rural, unlike your state, and this might not meet your needs, but it's something to think about in your policy agenda. And I wish you lots of luck. Thanks.